Hello everyone, good afternoon. My name is Jamie Collins and I'm the Director of Planning and Development with the City of Little Rock, and I am here with John Honeywell. He is the Director of Public Works with the City of Little Rock, and we're here to kind of go through this on this virtual town hall to talk about some questions that we've received in regards to our proposed changes. I would like to start out this by just talking about some timelines with the codes. Some people, when they review all these codes, they don't realize the time frame of when these codes were originally prepared and submitted to the city for the city board for adoption. Our original zoning codes were started back in 1961. Our last major revisions that we did spanned several years in the late 80s, adding some zoning classifications to some plan developments and revising some zoning. So as you can see, it's been well over 30 years since the City of Little Rock has took this initiative to look at our entire development code, specifically as it pertains to zoning and storm drainage and just development criteria in general, to try to align it with current trends, current zoning practices, and also what staff and the public has seen over the years. These codes have also been through a public hearing on January 9th with our Planning Commission. We advertised that for public input. We presented it to the Planning Commission, and it was voted unanimously to support and submit to the Board of Directors for consideration. So at this time, I would like to kind of go through and start looking at some of these questions and reading them out and giving the answers accordingly. The first one that we have that was submitted in was from Doug. He was just, in general, he was opposed to any revision of the landscape ordinance that would weaken the ordinance. And that is not what we were doing in this. The primary reason that we revised the landscape ordinance was due to just the area for our tree fund. Whenever somebody had a land clearing or an infraction that we cited somebody on for removal of trees, it was specific to a quad map or a section of where you could replace these trees. And so what we was looking to do was revise the area to not just be within the section map, but within a certain radius, and we chose the mile radius. So what that does is we've had in the past areas that we have had infractions to that ordinance and we've replaced trees, and we could have replaced trees in an area not just necessarily on the site but across the roadway or a block away, and we couldn't do that because it went over into another section. So really looking at trying to just expand an area that we can utilize our tree fund in when developers pay into this fund to put trees in the right-of-way or other public places. And this allows us a little more leeway in doing so. And the other section had to do with just clarification of what, when a developer or a consultant prepares a landscape plan, just giving on-site conditions, especially in a pre-developed state, that we have a little bit of leeway, and we currently have that leeway to kind of look at it for just to adjust the landscape plan based upon site conditions. And this just clarified it that really is a staff level review. The next one I have is just from Ken, who states the Arkansas Democrat Gazette in its 5/10/2020 edition noted that the mayor said an ad hoc red tape committee of people in the planning and development field have been meeting with Planning and Development Director Jamie Collins for the past year and a half on updating the zoning ordinance. It says, please name those in the committee. Well, what we have is we did meet with developers, we met with citizens, we met with just landowners in this past year to talk with them. A couple of those members that we did meet with and submit stuff to that got submitted out was William Clark of Clark Construction and Chris East of Cromwell Architects. Another question that was raised is, please describe in detail what input regular citizens of Little Rock have had in forming this proposed revision. And as I stated previously, we utilize the Planning Commission, especially when it goes as an ordinance to anything for the board, for that public hearing, because we really want the public input. So we set that up to be heard on January 9th and advertised it in the paper to get input, and there was several citizens there for input and gave that, and we adjusted some of the ordinances accordingly. If I may, I'd like to go back to and read one of the questions that we've got on the live chat so that we don't miss anybody. We try to go through some of this stuff. The first question was, please expand on the last 3 items in the executive summary. And the executive summary, if I'm remiss to not say it at the very first, all these documents are on our website, littlerock.gov. If you go to our Planning and Development Department, it is right there on the home page. There's 2 links that you can go to. One specifically goes to the executive summary, and what that is just to try to hit the high points. There's about 50 to 60% of these code revisions that really pertains to alignment of our development process to help streamline that process. And the 2 main departments that deal with that process is Planning and Development and Public Works. And so some of that, I will answer some of those, and then I will give some of those off to Director Honeywell to answer. So on the last 3 items of this is under off-street parking and loading section, minor revisions were made to reduce parking requirements for churches, general business, professional office, retail sales, and shopping center. This is also attached an allowance to increase the amount of off-site parking that can be used from 25 to 50%. To expand on that, we've seen over several years in development that there is areas of parking that are underutilized within an entire development. And there are also areas of parking that are needed. Downtown is a good example. We do have downtown parking garages, but other areas as development go out west, they're large parking lots. And what this does is this is trying to align that and reduce that parking area that is needed. It's not limiting a developer to put in more parking. It is just setting and reducing a minimum standard that is needed for that. The second to the last on that page, it says increase the maximum height of a residential fence to 8 feet. And currently what we have in our code is that a residential fence is a 6-foot max height. So anything above that is sent as a variance to our Board of Adjustments. And what that means is that if they come in with the 7-foot or 8-foot, we send it through. And just over the past 3 years in development, we've seen probably 20 plus cases of fence height variance that would go to the Board of Adjustment. And nearly all of those have been approved for that. So what we do is when we was trying to streamline this process, we sat down and looked at that through our applications and says, that is really something that can be handled at staff level. It's being more a norm of a request for a fence height than not the norm. The last one was increase the height variance for signage from 15 to 20%. And again, what that is we're looking for the intent of the development in our zoning ordinances. So if the intent of the development is to allow ground signage or allow monument signage or a sign of a certain height or the number of signage, what we're looking for is to just try to get the intent. And when a development comes in, a lot of times they may have panels of places that need to come in and rent their space. They're doing this open box that hasn't been all leased out yet. And so what they're looking for is they're looking to come in and rent these panels out so these other entities that are coming in, a shopping mall or a center, hasn't have the sign yet placed in that sign package. And so what this does is that allows some of the developments that come in at a later date a little bit more leeway in getting their particular sign placed in a box or a panel or an additional sign that may be needed for an outlot or a parcel, trying to accommodate with what our current zoning is. And as described, it was currently 15%. And so in this review, we believe that an increase to 20%, which is 5% increase, was not that big of an increase for additional increase of the signage. from Jack and Roslyn, what it says is, and this is in regards to our Highway 10 Scenic Corridor Design Overlay District requirements. It says, now it appears that a developer can purchase a lot less than 1 acre and develop it without regard to the minimum lot size of 2 acres. Does this enable him to rezone this area? Regardless of the lot size, zoning is always taken to the board of directors because it is an action as required by state law in any type of rezoning. And I want to clarify that we did make some changes by comments that were received previously, that we really right now are only talking about existing lots that are lots of record that are 2 acres or less. So it is existing lots of record that are 2 acres or less, and they can rezone the property. So, but it still has to go through a zoning if it is not currently zoned what they want to use the property for. Above 2 acres, it would still have to go through a planned development per the design overlay district. The other question was, do you really think it is necessary to reduce the front yard requirement of 40 feet to 25 just to suit the development? I would like to clarify that one. That is currently existing in the code. We're not looking to change that to that classification. That's existing. And I can understand where that looked like we was changing that, but that actually is in there existing right now to do that. Another question is do you really believe these changes are in accordance with the mission statement, which is to enhance the quality of life for the residents of Little Rock through exceptional service that encourages quality growth, development, redevelopment, and the stabilization of neighborhoods through an efficient and equitable effort of planning, land use controls, historic preservation, permitting, and enforcement? And yes, we do believe that is, because part of that we really was doing this for was just to be more efficient in our processing, in our alignment. And as I was speaking earlier, about 50 to 60% of these changes has to do with just alignment of responsibility. It's not eliminating the other departments' involvement. It's just pushing the alignment of where the application goes and the process through all applications into one location. And so with that, yes, I do believe it is more efficient to do that in that aspect, and and we do believe that it's going to be, a growth stimulant in there. I can't tell you exactly, how much. It could typically, instead of taking 60 to 90 days to go through the process, it could take 30 to 60 days to go through the process in this alignment. And we do believe it stabilizes the neighborhoods. Because also in doing so with other things that we're going to explain on and some of these other questions, going in this process, we went more electronic. Electronic not only in our plan submission, but also electronic in our comments and how we submit to our planning commissioners and also to our neighborhood associations. And currently we do have the ability to send electronic information to our neighborhood associations when we get something. So it's not just driven by, you need to go to this location and pick it up, or come by our office and go look at something. We want to make it more available for people to look at and give comments to. So in that manner, we do believe that is more of an equitable effort in our planning, land use and historic preservation, permitting, and enforcement. One of the questions says that the minor storm easement relates to the 10-year storm event, but the executive summary says the minor storm easement shall relate to the 25-year storm event. Which is more reasonable? Which is it? John, if you want to answer that one.
Certainly, Jamie. We are proposing to change that to the 25-year storm event, and that's what will be identified in the code revision that will be going before the board. The 25-year storm event is actually a higher intensity storm event, so you'll actually get better flood control better reduction in the impact to other properties and other drainage systems in the city by using that 25-year storm event versus the 10-year storm event.
Thank you, John.
You're welcome.
I'd like to go to a question we received from Pam. The question is it says methods for determining stormwater runoff shall be designated by the latest City of Little Rock Stormwater Management and Drainage Manual. What do they base the manual on? A manual can be changed at any time.
Our manual is based on best engineering practices that we've developed over many years. Our stormwater manual is actually one that we've had for some time, and we are continuously looking at that and other examples of what other regions or areas of the country are doing and related to stormwater. We are planning to look at that potentially in more detail in the future. But right now, the benefit of having a manual like that, it is something that we can go back and look at and adjust accordingly if we see need to make changes in it. It's a little easier process. We still do the public involvement and do that process, but by having it in a manual that's separated out from the code, it makes it a more streamlined process, and we do want to make adjustments to that.
Thank you, John. Another question for Pam is which city officials, as quoted in many places, will be the responsible party for all these approvals? As explained a little bit in that alignment, the majority of that will go through the Planning and Development Department, but there is some sections of that code as it relates to existing infrastructure, existing right-of-way, downstream structures, that Public Works, because they are the responsible entity for the maintenance of all those structures, they have the responsibility to review those and approve those. Another statement question that Pam has is, I understand that the subdivision committee does not vote. However, it is a good committee to have in place so that they can focus on subdivisions and the public can speak with the people who would theoretically know the most about it. There is no way a planning commissioner can know all the details of all these regulations. And Pam, that's a great statement, and just understanding what the subdivision committee does within our current process. The subdivision committee was set up at one time, and yes, correct, to vote. They actually voted on the items that come before them to pass it on to the Planning Commission. That is no longer the case. Over nearly a couple decades now, since then, it has turned into a technical review committee. So the applicants are the only one that come to that meeting, along with staff and a portion of the Planning Commission. Not all the Planning Commissioners come there. And they sit down and they go over the comments that the staff has written and present them to the applicant so the applicant can have any questions at that moment and we can explain them. But we also explain it and send out more detailed stuff as they ask that we can present. That is held at noon. And so not all the Planning Commissioners have knowledge of that. And so the intent of that is since it's primarily a technical review committee, we're looking to just have that with staff only. And then we're going to forward, where only 4 or 5 would get that, we're going to forward those comments prior to that meeting to our planning commissioners and make that available to them. So they will be able to, contact us, ask us questions, particularly about a certain item. But instead of just a few of them being able to have access to it, all of them will have access to it. Another question is will private streets now be encouraged? And John and you and I have talked about this in the past. Could you elaborate on that?
Certainly. Private streets have always been allowed in the city of Little Rock. They are, just to explain a little bit of maybe more background behind that, you have 2 different types of streets in the city. You have public streets where they are on property that is owned by the city of Little Rock, either through dedication by the developer or it's property that was owned by the city previously. And those streets and that infrastructure that's built there is maintained by the city at the city's cost. Private streets are typically on land owned either by a private individual or, say, a property owners association in a subdivision, and that association is responsible for the maintenance and upkeep of that infrastructure. Street, curb, sidewalks, drainage, all of that is the responsibility of those private parties. So if, for instance, a community would like to have a gated community that is restricted for access, those are required to be a private street. That way it allows them to control who gains access to that private property. If it was a public street and you tried to restrict access to it, that's where we have issues legally with it being a public road and not allowing the public to use a public road. So certainly, depending on a developer, we allow them to make that decision of whether or not they want their infrastructure to be private or public based on what development they are doing and how they proceed to either market that or develop it residentially or commercially.
Thanks, John. Another question I have from Doug. It says, will the city staff have staff assigned with specific responsibility of helping existing residents and homeowners who may be harmed by proposals of developers? And I think that also ties to one of other thing that Doug has on here. It says, it has been reported that the restructured development division will include staff who focus solely on helping applicants. It says Director Collins described these staff as concierge for development. That is the same entity, and we are obliged to process all applications, and we want to notify everybody. And that same entity, the development specialist, is really what we're talking about. It is going to be their responsibility to go through this process from start to finish. It is also their responsibility to make sure that if there's any notifications to go out to the neighborhood associations and also to any other adjacent entity as required by our bylaws, that happens. And they are also there to field any questions and to find the right either department or entity within those departments to answer those questions and make that connection not only between the applicants, which could be developers, it could also be consultants, but also the residents of the city of Little Rock. So it is for both of them. I'd like to go on to a question that Leanne has, regarding, she asked, will anything in the proposed changes make it easier for neighbors to comment on projects? And part of her question, that answer is yes. That's part of that going more digital. We're going to be putting more information out when we receive applications, when we get within a certain time frame of that technical review section, of actually putting out more of that information where more people has access to it prior to the Planning Commission. She addressed it by her concern is that of the neighbors is that the house across from apparently where she is received a variance and that only needed approval from staff, and they weren't notified, and therefore they wasn't present at the Board of Adjustment or the Planning Commission. Well, on those items, and there are items that can be approved by staff, that's part of that variance request that's in there, and the general intent of the code. If it falls within those percentages for those variances and it can be approved at staff level, it does not go to a Board of Adjustment or a Planning Commission level. It stays at staff level. But I understand your concern, Leanne, and typically when we do those, we didn't really reach out to the neighborhood and send the stuff in because it's staff level review, and that's what we're allowed to do and sign off. But we are more than happy to meet with the neighbors. I think in this new electronic process that we're doing and notification, we should be able to send out information to the neighborhood associations of any change that's going to be proposed, even at an item base or even a staff level base. So it's something that we can consider and that we will look at. Another question from Lynn said, initial planners may have thought people would hop on and off the streetcar to shop, but now employees leave their cars all day in residential areas to leave room for customers and cars on-site in on-site spots. Why make it worse? Well, it depends on where the location is. Like I said, in part of these parking, revisions that we're putting in there, it's just a standard. It is set of this is what the parking is, can use, and we do want to maximize parking in an area, but we also want to look at what is happening on the roadway. So we do review parking requirements on where they're going to park, where they're going to walk, how far they're going to walk. And typically we're looking for, we know that if somebody parks, are they going to walk 1 block, 2 blocks, 3 blocks, to get to that development? And how far are we going to support the use of off-street or on-street parking as opposed to the parking that's provided, adjacent to the building? And so those are considerations that staff looks at when we look at any development and whether we support an approval of that if it goes through the Planning Commission or not. And John can speak to a little bit of that because Public Works, we do currently, even look at that for how it affects a roadway, in the parking and the circulation that is going on site and how it affects the circulation on the roadway.
Yeah, certainly we look at a development, especially commercial type developments. What is the impact to the existing infrastructure, street, on-street parking, off-street parking, by that development and the proposed use and what we consider to be the anticipated amount of traffic and parking that's coming and going from that site. So we do look at that in relationship to the location that we're talking about specifically. It's something that we always consider and try to mitigate as best as possible. So some of the steps that we're taking here gives us a little more flexibility in terms of accommodating the parking that's necessary, but also keeping in mind the necessary parking demands both on our public streets and within the development itself.
Thanks, John. Let's go back to the live chat, the YouTube. A question here is, what do these changes do to promote green space and retention of unique habitats? Currently, in the revisions that are proposed, we didn't propose any additional green space requirements that are not already within our codes. There are already sections of our code that require landscape buffers adjacent, specific to certain types of zoning that are adjacent to a different zoning, and open space requirements adjacent to certain types of floodways and floodplains. So right now, the proposed revisions do not address that specific question. Another question was, is for commercial developments, board fences become unsightly fairly quickly? I've been told that board fences are required on back and sides. If used, could decorative metal fencing be an option? Decorative metal fencing, especially for residential, is an option. And depending on where the decorative metal fencing is in a commercial development or an office development, it could be used as an option. Typically, though, certain areas, specifically around dumpsters, we do not want a see-through fence to look at a dumpster pad or a dumpster location just in case trash gets out of the dumpster. We want that enclosed and not visible from the outside. So that is an option that the developers can put that in, and we've had those put in, but it is not a requirement, but is always an option. The question is, will additional citizen input be sought with adequate notice provided before final decisions are made on the code changes? Currently, right now, these proposed changes are looked to go for the Board of Directors on May 19th. And as I've stated previously, we have went out on January 9th of this year for our Planning Commission for our public hearing for that portion. And this is one of our notifications that we're having, this live chat that John and I are doing to try to answer some of these questions that they have so that we can answer them. And any questions that you have even after this, if you'll send them in to us, to the City of Little Rock, to the notifications provided on the live chat. Also, you can send it into lrzoning@littlerock.gov. We'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody might propose. I would like to go on to some questions that were proposed by Catherine. One question she had was, what constitutes an analysis of all stormwater conveyance for the 100-year storm event? What will this look like and how detailed will it be required to be? John?
And I believe this is referring to when someone's developing a parcel of property or a plat of property. What we would like them to look at is in the 100-year storm event, which is your most intense storm occurrence, we would like them to look at where does the water move across that property so it can be accommodated as part of the design. What we don't want to happen is for someone to develop a subdivision or a commercial development where they have a layout of lots and streets and underground drainage, and you end up building across a existing drainage area that causes those homes or those buildings as part of that development to become flooded. So what we're asking for here is the developer to look at the existing conditions of their property, develop a study that shows where those limits are, and then as part of their development plan, they have to use that and determine how are they going to accommodate that across their property where it doesn't negatively impact their development. That's the purpose behind that. And the detail of that, it's not necessarily an extremely detailed, in-depth look. You're looking at the big picture of where does the water go, what are the extents of where we think the edges of any kind of flooding that might occur in the current conditions that exist prior to actually doing any kind of new construction development on the site.
Hey, keep it in that same question line. It says, could you explain the changes to how floodways are defined? Is the National Flood Insurance Program definition broader? For instance, my backyard floods when a city creek overflows. So is my backyard now considered a floodplain? Will this result in stricter requirements for developments?
So let's sort of take, these are sort of multiple questions. I'll try to answer them in order. How are floodways or floodplains defined? Those are part of the mapping that occurs under the National Flood Insurance Program, which is part of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And what occurs there is detailed engineering studies that are very, very in-depth, looking at large areas of land. They come in and actually develop elevations that will be inundated during a flooding situation, and they put those limits of the flooding onto maps. So you can see a parcel of property. Does it have flooding that occurs when you have a certain rainfall event that occurs? So that's sort of the definition of a floodway. That is the most constrained area that you cannot alter or do work in because it will impact the flood elevations that occur upstream and downstream if you get in that area. So our definition of floodway is the same definition as that of the National Flood Insurance Program. We use the same definitions because the City of Little Rock is part of the National Flood Insurance Program. We are members of that and participated in it. So when you speak to your backyard, and I don't know where you live, but not everywhere where you might have water from either a drainage or just a rainfall event where water stands or flows through it is considered a floodplain or a floodway. Only those areas that have had that detailed study and that it's been accepted by FEMA are defined in our program as being in a floodplain / floodway. So as far as restrictor requirements for developments, that's really not changing. The change from the 10-year to the 25-year storm event, which is what Jamie referred to earlier, for easements and our minor storm event, that actually puts not necessarily stricter, but it makes the developers accommodate a more intense storm, which should improve flooding for adjacent or other properties, both their own and those adjacent or downstream, when it comes to any kind of flooding events. And I think I answered all of those on there.
I think that's pretty good. Another question we have is why the change to allow denser developments? Well, one, we don't believe that is really a dominant change. We have dense development within the city of Little Rock. Primarily, that's been more concentrated in our what we would call our urban use or UU type zoning, and it's concentrated mainly downtown and also some other areas where more of that downtown shopping atmosphere, live, office, atmosphere is, primarily what that dense development is. But what we're looking for is, it's just a change. If you're talking about making subdivisions a little bit more dense, just the type of lots that people are looking to buy, from what we've been hearing from development across the years, is they're looking for smaller lots. You can kind of see that in development across the city as you start going from downtown and you start going back to the west. At one time, we would call them the lot and block development, which would be the Capitol View Stiff Station area, where there were 25 to 50 foot wide lots that people developed on, and you could buy a full lot, you could buy half of a lot and build something on. And then as you go out to about the Midtown area, in that type of development in those years, primarily 70s, early 80s, the ranch style home was going into. So you're looking at wider lots to accommodate those ranch style homes. So, and now as you start going out further west in development, even to the southwest that we've seen, and also just south of it, of the city, at that time, lots are getting smaller. So the ranch style home was not a home that was built in the late 90s, early 2000s. They started getting more narrow, and they started going more vertical, multiple stories, split levels. And so now what we're seeing is they're looking to get even, more of a narrow lot. So instead of being at a 75 foot or 50 foot lot, they're looking to be more narrow than that, and actually going more stories, getting that second, third story in development. And what does that mean? Well, that means, and it depends on the acreage, that instead of a development coming in and having 75 lots for their subdivision, it may mean that they get 80 to 90 lots for that subdivision. And that does help offset the cost of development, but it could also make homes more affordable just for the size of the home that is being built on a per square foot basis. To some of the new generations coming up that want to buy or make homes a little more affordable than looking at the 5,000 square foot home on a larger lot. So it is something that we've been seeing over the past years, that developments are getting more dense. And so what we're looking at is we're looking to accommodate that within our codes. So instead of going in and requesting variances that you have a minimum lot width, we're looking at it that this is something that is coming on, and we're looking to accommodate that. And one of the questions is, and I think it's a duplicate questions that we have, it says, does the removal of the sentence, private streets for residential development shall be discouraged, indicate a philosophical shift?
I don't think it does. That is something that's been in the code for as long as I've known about it. And it's something that was probably there way before I knew about it. So it's something that we've never discouraged as a staff person. If someone wants to make something a private street, typically those are a cul-de-sac loop type street where it's not a connection between one street and another, so you're not blocking off the ability for someone to move across the city. So typically we have not discouraged private development if it's in those type of, or private streets if it's in that type of scenario.
Thanks, John. We also have a question from Andrew. Is there any consideration given to maintain existing or minimize stormwater runoff to a development's non-pervious structures to prevent future work on existing stormwater systems?
There certainly is. That is actually part of our code now. The city requires development to look at their existing condition of their property, be it raw land, forest, grass, or it's an existing parking lot. We make them look at what is that condition of that property now prior to development, so you can determine what's the runoff from a stormwater event from that property. We then make them do the calculations of how has that runoff changed with their development. Are they creating more impervious space, so you're going to have higher amounts of runoff? And then once we determine those differences between the pre-existing condition and the post condition, we make them actually do detention on site. So they limit the amount of stormwater that is able to leave their site. And that's been a part of our code for many years. And it's something that we intend to keep into the future, because that is what helps us mitigate any impact to downstream infrastructure that we may have or adjacent property owners from that development and any kind of stormwater that's being run off of those.
Thanks, John. Another question that we have is, the first is a statement, then they get onto the question. It says, it's in regards to our land alteration. It says, these exceptions from obtaining a permit do not relieve the property owner and or applicant from taking measures to protect neighboring public and private properties from damage by exempted activities. If a land alteration activity causes damage to off-site property or water, the responsible party shall mitigate the damage and install such additional erosion controls as approved by the appropriate city official to prevent further damage. What are the channels of recourse for property owners affected by damage? Will the city be overseeing this, or will this be strictly a civil matter? And I can answer that. The city will oversee that. Right now, what the exemption was, it was 2 acres or less, did not need to get a grading permit within the city. And so at that point in time, we could go out there and we would talk to them, and it wasn't really tied to a building permit per se. And so what we're doing is we're trying to close that gap. What we're trying to do is, even though by the state regulations that is exempted from a notice of intent to disturb land by state requirement that we do go look at, this is a city requirement that even though they are underneath that 2-acre minimum, that does not mean that they can just go out there and disturb land and not put up silt fences or stop erosion control. That gives us the ability to go out within our building construction department and see, when they do single family homes and those types of developments that are less than 2 acres, and if erosion is happening off the property, we can cite them underneath our building codes. We can get them to remediate those infractions or encroachments off their property. And so at that time, we would take them to our environmental court for that action. But that does not stop any private entity or adjacent property from seeking any civil action if they chose to do so. One of the questions, and I talked a little bit about that previously, about the subdivision committee, explaining what their role was, has been in the past. So one of the questions is, why was the subdivision committee dissolved, and how will it affect the community's access to input on developments? Well, I'll explain a little bit why we're looking to dissolve that committee, but I would like to address that specific question about, will that affect the community's access to input on developments? And that answer is, it will not. The community will have the same access and input to developments as they've had before, even if the subdivision committee is dissolved. They can still contact city staff. They can come to our public meetings. They can email us. Any email that we receive, either for or against an item, is saved and is presented to the planning commissioners prior to the meeting and put in the file. So it does not decrease the amount of any citizen involvement. I believe, let's go over and see if there's any additional ones on the live chat. I don't see any additional ones. So we went through the majority of these questions. Some of these was duplicates from ones that we answered. Again, I want to remind everybody that it will be on for consideration on the May 19th Board of Directors meeting. Please, if you have any questions, please send them in. You can send them directly to our office. You can contact even John has been contacted at Public Works. We forward stuff back and forth. We want to share everything that we get, and they'll all be shared with the Board of Directors when we meet. You can send them to LR Zoning, that's LRZONING @littlerock.gov. Thank you very much.
Thank you.